Hi, my name is Juliet, and I'm the creator and host of Connecting the Dots podcast. I love ideas and problem solving, and my career in communication has led me down a path of curiosity. Why we do what we do, how we tell better stories, and how African scientists solve everyday problems. Join me on this enlightening and entertaining exploration of African science like you've never experienced before. Get ready to laugh, learn, and be inspired. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Connecting the Dots podcast. Our world is facing a climate crisis with extreme weather and environmental degradation becoming daily realities. Yet, an often overlooked part of this story is a web of politics, economics, and systems of exploitation that shape both our lives and the planet's health. We take a critical look at the intersection of environmental justice, neocolonialism, and capitalism. Our guest challenges us to explore climate action that addresses the historical injustices shaping our world. Professor Lesley Green is the founding director of Environmental Humanities South, an accredited research center attached to the University of Cape Town in South Africa, where she is professor of anthropology. Lesley specializes in transdisciplinary curriculum development in support of the transformation of higher education to address the planetary crisis. In addition to her work as an educator, she's the co-lead of the Water Stories website that aims to share research and increase public understanding of water pollution. We're very excited to host you on Connecting the Dots podcast. Welcome, Professor Lesley Green.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Prof, we always like to start this podcast by getting a sense of your background. So in hindsight, is there anything from your childhood or perhaps even broader, your ancestry that shaped your work as an anthropologist and an environmentalist?
Well, let me start a little bit more recently. About 20 years ago, I was working in the Amazon rainforest on an archaeological project and realized very quickly that there was enormous contestation over the environment. And I wanted to work on that. And also, because of the work we were doing, I realized there was extraordinary riches of indigenous knowledge to work with. And there was just so much to work with. But what I was seeing with some of the conservation groups that were working in the area was complete insensitivity, if not perhaps just a misunderstanding of what it meant to be an indigenous person in the rainforest. So, for example, they would send, master students from a big city to teach people about alligators, but these are people who live with alligators. And so the teaching should have gone the other way around.
Right.
And so on and so on. Or the other, situation that really bothered me was because of the archaeological work we were doing on a particular site. That site was a site of trauma because it was a site of the first enslavements where an encampment had been raided and people had been taken and many people had been killed by alligators because they jumped into the water to try and get away and the alligators took them. So it's a site that nobody farms on, and yet the conservationists set up their research station on that site because they wanted to work with alligators. And this caused, enormous upset, and the conservation was just simply not aware of it. So I started to teach a course. When I got back here, I decided I wanted to put a course on the books that would link tradition, society, and environment. And from there, the project developed into the book, which an edited collection of studies, mainly by African students, but also in dialogue with some Latin Americans, called Contested Ecologies, where we were looking at how landscapes can be so fundamentally misunderstood and the kinds of knowledges that could be coming into the sciences, but are not because they're not part of the scientific tradition officially. So, fast forward a long time, then began to do some work with fisheries, contestation over fisheries here in Cape Town, where once again, the fishers were fighting for the right to catch and sell their fish, but they were classified as artisanal fishers and they weren't allowed to sell fish. So that meant that they could eat fish, but how do you pay school fees if you can't sell your fish,
Yeah.
All of these things kind of turmoiled, and I became more and more aware of my own work being, what does it mean to be situated as a white South African in doing environmental work? And as it happened, just as kind of a hobby, I was doing some research on my own family and discovered to my horror that 3 great uncles had bought an elephant gun. They were all settlers, English settlers. They'd bought an elephant gun, and there was a record of them shooting 100 elephants in one day at the mouth of the Fish River.
And what year is this?
It's written about in the 1840s.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, so what does that mean to be a white South African doing environmentalism amidst this course of poaching? Well, my bloodline survived thanks to rampant poaching. So it meant I had to situate myself differently in the work. So what we've built here in Environmental Humanities South is a team of amazing, energetic, early career African research scholars who are working at the intersection of social sciences and environmentalism. And one of our projects we done together with colleagues from the universities of Addis Ababa, Dar es Salaam, Lilongwe University of Agriculture, and the University of Zimbabwe, and of course ourselves at the University of Cape Town, together with the Human Sciences Research Council, because what we wanted to do was rethink how climate policy engages with questions of justice. And the key issue for us is that the discourses and languages of sustainability, as they've emerged in the last decade, have increasingly focused on financialization. But Earth doesn't run on dollar values.
Right.
Earth does not run on dollar values. So you've got the work of sustainability sciences absolutely dedicated to trying to bring about change, but are they addressing the right questions? Are they asking the right questions? And in working with communities all down the East African coast and in Southern Africa, the issue of what communities know about their environments is huge. I mean, people know where the water will flood. They know where it will be dry. They've got an intimate understanding of soil and its relations and what does that mean to farm and to make a living out of your soil. They understand their soils very, very well. And yet those knowledges, once again, just like the alligators in Brazil, are not being taken into account. Even worse, a lot of the sustainability work, which is taking place in carbon trading, etc., often doesn't connect at all with what people are going through at a local level. And in fact, the contrary, to support sustainability through the new rare earths and metals, you can have absolute devastation happening at a local level in the name of sustainability. So Africa's been on the receiving end of centuries of environmental exploitation, including my own ancestors. And it's time to fix that. So I can't fix that myself, but I can leverage my privilege as a white South African who grew up in the apartheid years to open up a space for early career scholars to have a voice and to do the kind of research that will put African environmentalism into dialogue with Global North dialogues.
And Lesley, when we look at your heritage, it's very interesting the example you've given about your ancestors and the elephants, and also just the harm and the damage that's going to Africa's environment, whether it's mining for metals or even to our wildlife. If you look at urbanization, you recently published a book. You're an award-winning author, Rock, Water, Life, Ecologies and Humanities for Decolonizing South Africa. I wonder if you can talk to just a little bit the relationship between inequality, racism, colonialization, and environmental exploitation, and especially in Cape Town, and what you're seeing there and your role, your multidisciplinary work at the University of Cape Town.
Thank you. So the research study area that we're working on in the Cape area is all of the studies in all of the countries are peri-urban. And that begins with the realization that your peri-urban areas are really under threat. Cities, almost globally, cities began historically where there's water, where there's good soil. Yeah. But over time, those have become industrial zones, they've become urban zones, financial zones, and the waters and soils that made that city possible have been eroded. So there's more and more pressure on the peripheries of cities. Roughly 100 kilometers outside any city in a ring, you will find an area that's in real trouble. One of those areas is an area called the Cape Flats, which is peri-urban Cape Town. And one of the things that characterizes a lot of the peri-urban areas is that there are spaces for processing waste from the city, so sewage works and waste dumps, etc. And along with the urban poor, because housing will be cheaper and so on. So there's immense pressures on those lands from land grabbing, from speculators, for farming, for water, for waste processing. And these characterize the study areas that we're working in. But it's been very, very interesting to look at the history of the Cape Flats in Cape Town. The Cape Flats was a marshy, sandy wetland forever until around about the 1970s, when the apartheid state decided that that would be a space to put people of color in their group areas. But it began with an ecocide. I found the maps of the 1969 Group Areas Act spatial planning for the city of Cape Town. It's genuinely shocking to see that in these sand dunes, which are wetlands, and the sand dunes operate as sponges, the first thing they did was allocate the silica-rich sands to the glass company to make glass, and the limestone-rich sands were allocated to a cement company. So the entire place begins with a wetland The sand dunes operate as sponges to hold the water. If you take those sand dunes out, you're going to have flooding. And even more incriminating is that they knew how to build in wetlands. So they brought in one of the major mining companies, Anglo-American, to build a white area in the wetlands, which to this day is a beautiful place on the water. The water is carefully channeled. They used the sand to build mounds, and they hard surfaced the edges of these. So they knew how to build in a wetland. But for Black and coloured people in the apartheid classification, that area was erased. So we have 1% of the fynbos biodiversity left in terms of botanical biodiversity. We have 1% of the Cape Flats fynbos. So on one hand, you've got an extinction risk, and then you've got conservationists who are absolutely dedicated, and I salute them. They find a species, and they know that there's maybe 100 specimens of that plant left in the whole world, and they're working so hard to protect them in a nature conservation estate with its fences around the West Dump.
Sorry, and to interject and ask you very quickly, when the allocation was being done, is it possible that maybe they did not have the science to inform where to put the sites, whether it's a cement company? Is it that they were not advised or did not even seek indigenous knowledge or the community knowledge of the area?
I think it was crass racism, frankly. Okay. It was about forcing people of colour out of the city into this wasteland. And frankly, I think they couldn't give a damn. And the fact that they knew how to build in a wetland and built a white area in a wetland is very telling. And that area to this day is high value property because the water is in canals. It's literally a suburb on a wetland. You can paddle to your neighbour in a boat. Yeah. So they simply removed those sand dunes in the area designated for people of colour. They removed those sand dunes, allocated them to the glass company or the cement company to remove them. And then you're left with whatever geological substrate is left, which is typically a kind of a red oxidey, stony thing that you can do very little with, and which is quite water resistant. So water just sits on it and it can't go in. Yeah. So it exacerbated the flooding. But I want to come back to this thing of the conservationists who are really dedicated at preventing extinctions, but they're also equally dedicated to preserving that last 1% behind fences in a nature reserve that is situated around a waste dump, because for some unknown reason, the license conditions of the waste dump require a 400-meter offset zone, and that was allocated to the nature reserve, which of course also falls outside the city in the peri-urban area. So you've got people living in shacks. You've got tremendous housing pressures in Cape Town. People move in around the waste dump because they're making a living recycling on the waste dump. But various government ministries then bring in private security, not police. They bring in private security to chase these people off in the name of this is a conservation area. And people are like, but there's a waste dump. No, this is a nature conservation area. So there's incredible violence against homeless people who, by the time you're building a shack around a waste dump, you really are at the end of the line.
Yes. Yeah.
And to be told you've got to move because this is a nature conservation area, and if you don't, you are violently removed. It's not a politically sustainable way to do environmentalism. At some point, there will be a revolt against the nature conservation. And so what you have there is science using the guns of the state or standing behind the guns of the state to implement its policies. And that is not politically sustainable. And our argument is if it's not politically sustainable, it's not environmentally sustainable. And what we're trying to say to the conservationists is, can you see the struggles you have to preserve those species that are at risk of extinction? It's the same struggle. It's got the same root in the eco side that makes people homeless. Can you see? So there's a different kind of politics that's possible if we ally together and say we've got a historical situation here that's brought us to this place. We've got a real mess. We've got extinction risks. We've got homelessness. We've got contamination. Can we address those together? So if out of our project we can succeed in getting that collaboration, we will have done a lot.
And if I was to ask you top 3 solutions to the issues you just listed out, what would those be? Just very quickly.
Well, for a start, contaminants hurt everybody. Doesn't matter what your area was once designated at or what your skin was once designated. Contaminants hurt everybody. So when you've got sewage works that are releasing hydrogen sulfide gases, or you've got waste dumps that are releasing noxious gases along with methane, that hurts everybody. It damages the commons. So what we're trying to do is work towards helping municipalities understand that urban metabolism is the way that we can kind of start to close the gaps that keep people impoverished. So, for example, the waste dump harvests methane, which is wonderful because methane comes from rotting organic matter, and it's one of the worst greenhouse gases. It's much more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And so what we're saying to the city officials is you are harvesting that gas and we celebrate you for doing that. But instead of selling that on, what about if you clean it up, which is not that complicated an engineering process, clean it up and make it available to local people so that you can start to address the energy poverty. Then, first of all, you're starting to use the environment in the interests of people, but also in winter when it's very, very cold, a lot of people survive and keep warm by burning plastic.
Wow.
Which produces tremendous air pollution.
Right.
And in Cape Town, you've got a thermal inversion. Your warm layers of air get trapped in winter at lower level by the higher cold layers of air. So that what that means is the air pollution gets trapped. You get this terrible smog. So by tending to the metabolism of the cities, we could start to improve that quality of life. Another example is processing of garden waste. There's again something to be celebrated. A waste processing facility, people can drop off their garden waste and it gets mulched up. But then it gets sold on. Whereas on the Cape Flats, you've got people trying to grow food in what's effectively just a grey beach sand with very low nutrient density.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's a simple closing of the loop. So we call that urban metabolism. Where do the nutrients go? Where does the water go? How do we clean up the groundwater? How do we make sure that the nutrients go somewhere? So it's attending to nutrients, contaminants, and water. And if we can address those, we improve the quality of life significantly for everybody. But this is a global challenge. Cities everywhere have been designed with waste streams as if there's a place called nowhere on the planet. There is no nowhere, right? We need to find a way to bring those back so that we replenish and renew, which is what a tree does. So our little motto is thinking like a tree.
I love that, thinking like a tree. And when you say thinking like a tree, what do you mean?
Well, that comes actually from reading Wangari Maathai with her, the way that she talks about soil and the way that she teaches women to plant trees and restore landscapes by restoring the trees. And the thing about what Wangari taught, which my colleagues in geophysics have kind of rediscovered in their own direction in the last 10 years, but Wangari was at it for a long time.
Yeah.
When you bring the trees back, you also bring the water back because the tree roots hold the water and of course they create shade so that the sands are cool. They're providing leaf cover so that your nutrients and your water are taken care of. Your nutrient cycles and your water cycles are much better. And as Wangari attested to, it had a huge impact on the lives of women and children who were in these desolate peri-urban areas, abandoned by men who had gone off to try and earn cash because it was hard to scratch a living in the rural area.
Right.
And also thinking like a tree is thinking vertically. We've got the property mindset, thinks on the horizontal. It thinks like when you look at a map or on Google Earth, you're looking from everywhere and nowhere at this map. And we've got property boundaries here, here, and here. And we have legal boundaries that follow those property boundaries. But that's not how the earth works. So a large part of wealth is simply in redirecting those flows because currently our nutrients are going often out to rivers and out to sea. They're going to the wrong place and tree cover is being removed. So it's about restoring the ecological processes and metabolic cycles in these peri-urban areas to restore soils. And that then drops your temperatures as well. So we think what we're looking at is a way of doing affordable mitigation in the times of climate crisis and biodiversity loss.
And I want to take you back to when you say thinking like a tree, thinking vertically upwards, and it's interesting even when you're talking about people who are poorer in the winter seasons in Cape Town, South Africa, banning plastics, and that goes all up into the air, it's stuck in the stratosphere, and just the impact for the planet itself. I want to take you to the water situation, what you're looking at when you say cities have historically grown on marsh areas where there was waterways. What insights do you think we get from social sciences on understanding and addressing the whole water pollution, environmental degradation, and why is an integrated approach necessary for us now?
That's such a great question. We all grew up at school learning the water cycle is evaporation, condensation, precipitation, but cities don't work quite like that. Cities' water comes from dams, particularly in Africa where it's dry. In parts of Europe, they use groundwater and not dams. But there's dams, there's wastewater treatment works at the end of the pipes, there's injection of water into the ground often. So water flows not just through the ecological cycle, but also flows through an infrastructural cycle, and it flows through our bodies. So the water that flows through my body flows through everybody's bodies, one time or another. This insight that the same molecules of water that went through our ancestors' bodies can go through our bodies.
I'm getting goosebumps by just thinking about that.
Isn't that extraordinary?
Yeah, that's amazing.
It's not manufacturing water. right? Our water is there, and the quantity of fresh water that we've got on the planet is a tiny little bubble compared to the size of the Earth.
Yeah.
Drink seawater. So fresh water is very limited. And so what we talk about in the social sciences is the hydrosocial cycle, trying to understand not just the hydrological cycle, but the hydrological cycle through society and through infrastructure and through bodies. And that means that we need to be paying attention to, for example, the pharmaceuticals that we take, because those go through us back into the sewage system. And are the wastewater treatment works adequately removing those? Because in many cases, they're not. And those go into the ocean. Now, for example, antidepressants, when fish are exposed to antidepressants in the water that comes to them, they take more risks.
What does a fish taking more risk look like?
So if you think of a fish knowing there's an octopus nearby and it's going to catch it, it's going to be like a little bit more like, oh, no problem. No problem.
Yeah. Okay. It'll just be like, let's see how this goes.
Happy fish, right?
Yeah, a happy fish, antidepressants, yeah. Wow.
But more seriously, the things like ibuprofen, which is anti-inflammatory, that drug is very heavily found in the waters off the Cape Flats, in the ocean waters.
Yeah.
On the other side of Cape Town, where there's a big shack settlement around a bay, the same sea urchins that on one side of the ocean are exposed to high levels of anti-inflammatories, diclofenac, or also known as ibuprofen. That same species on the other side of Cape Town is exposed to very high levels of mebendazole, which is an anti-helminthic or deworming medication, often given to children in shack settlements.
Yeah.
And that species in the wealthy area is exposed to more cocaine and blood thinners, the kind of drugs that people who eat high cholesterol, fatty diets. So what are the evolutionary features of those sea urchins? Because they do have epigenetic effects.
Yeah.
And this is all about our water cycle. So many of these drugs have only come on the market, they've only been invented in the last 30 years. There are real consequences to them once they're out in the open, and they're molecules that don't break down in the open environment. So they're molecules that your cells can misrecognize, because your cells will recognize a certain kind of a keychain. It's like having a key for a lock. A cell will admit them. But if those molecules are not meant to be in those particular cells, they can cause harm to all species, not just ourselves. So we need to be paying a lot of attention to the flows of what goes through our bodies as well.
I wanted you to talk a little bit on the why an integrated approach, is necessary.
Integrated approaches. Well, if you walk down a road, any road, or you're on a bicycle, you don't pass the zoology division and the botany division and the chemistry division, right? And the accounting division. You don't. So I've learned so much from the decolonial student movement. And one of the things that they were calling for was education and scholarship that attended to lived experience.
And this was what happened. We saw these riots, I think it was back in 2015 in Cape Town.
15, 16, 17 were years of a lot of student struggle, calling for an African education. And, there were complications to the student movement. Of course, there always are. But the intellectual core of that was calling for an education based on lived experience. So in the work that we're working on habitability, how do you make peri-urban areas habitable? One is working with lived experience all the time, and one is working with everything is in there. In the example I've just given you, we've spoken about chemistry, we've spoken about bodies, we've spoken about medicine, we've spoken about poverty, about infrastructure, and the hydrological cycle, and the soils. It's all there. Our scholarship at our universities was invented and designed 150 years ago, which was the age of mercantile capitalism, the age of colonialism, the age of extraction, where scholarship needed to be able to tell its funders what is where and how do you get it, which included the take me to your leader kind of social sciences, anthropology being one of those. And when I look at spatial planning, for example, using these extraordinary technologies, geospatial technologies, there's a contradiction there, because we're using these extraordinary 21st century technologies to answer questions framed in 18th century disciplines. We have to bring them together. We have to answer the questions. The person who's living in the shack settlement who is burning plastic to eat is going to be suffering with inflamed sinuses, damaged respiratory tract. They're going to be having high blood pressure because air pollution causes high blood pressure. It moves into your blood very quickly. And they're going to be having headaches, inflammation. Then they're going to be having anti-inflammatory tablets from the local clinic, etc. The costs of living in a landscape that's not designed in an integrated way. Whereas if they were harvesting the methane from the waste dump and processing it and making it available affordably to energy poor households, we would solve how many of the problems? We'd solve the air pollution problem, which affects everyone.
Yeah.
We'd solve the need for more drugs and clinics and anti-inflammatories. We would reduce the number of contaminants that are going into the ocean. So the person that goes to the clinic in a condition like that typically is then given a corticosteroid drug to reduce inflammation, without recognition of the fact that they're living near sewage works. And one of the side effects of a corticosteroid is it reduces your immune function.
Systems,
So
yeah.
they're going to get more sick and more sick and more sick. So we need integrated medicine. We need integrated environmental management. And most important, we need to rethink economics, that economics is not just a matter of finance. Since the 1990s, we've accepted the theology of globalization, that gross domestic product is what we have to work with. And anything and everything that increases gross domestic product is the winner.
Yeah.
Game. Exactly. But Earth doesn't work like that. If you work on that basis, you are ignorant of Earth's processes. So we need a different kind of politics, a different kind of economics that partners with local Earth processes.
And Lesley, you were recently at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. What was your parting shot to the delegation that you led and your discussion points there in 1 minute?
I didn't lead a delegation, but I attended. And I was so impressed by the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who sat in this great big United Nations hall that you see on the news every other night and said to young people, my generation has failed. We believed the promises of globalization with its financialization, but now we have more war, we have more poverty, and we have more inequality than we've ever had. And we've got an Earth that is being scoured for resources. This is not the way we should have gone. There were no checks on globalization. And very strategically, basically has handed responsibility over to young people. The UN meeting left me inspired. It was very moving to be in there, knowing that that's the place where Kwame Nkrumah went and gave his extraordinary speech, where he said, I'm an African. There are 22 African countries represented here. We are the first, and we are changing the UN. And so the Antonio Guterres' speech reminded me of that because it was so similar. Not that he was saying he was an African, of course, but that he was saying we are here for change. And I thought, we've had other speeches in this very hall about change. But I thought what was courageous about Guterres' speech and what he's done is he's created a special office for UN youth. He's created the Assistant Secretary General position for youth, which is occupied by a young man in his 20s from Uruguay. I think he's realized that by the time people get to their 40s, 50s, and 60s, they're so invested in one thing or the other that they're not really that free. That change comes from young people. And he's opening the UN to young people to say, we will teach you how to use the system. We need you to use it. We need you to step in. So I think there's tremendous possibilities for our young people to step into leadership training and to move into positions of decision-making that are able to make different kinds of decisions in the next 10 years. The people don't have to wait until they're 55 before they can actually have an impact. So I really look forward to seeing what youth leadership, specifically from Africa, can bring.
And it sounds like the message is consistent across the board. Our previous hosts have talked a lot about how the role of young people. We had Professor Sam Kinyanjui, who was talking about an army of researchers, and he was just thrilled about all these young scientists who are upcoming. So it's nice to hear global leaders like Antonio who are creating opportunities to be able to invite them to the table. So very exciting to hear that. And Lesley, as we wind up, are you able to tell us just maybe 2 or 3 African scientists or other community leaders who inspire you? Who are they? What are they doing? And where are they?
Well, there's quite a few. Nimo Bassi in Nigeria is an architect and a poet, an environmentalist who's in many senses taken up the mantle of Ken Saro-Wiwa opposing the oil in the deltas. And he's an extraordinary figure and a very deep thinker. So Nimo Bassi, Mitika Mwenda, who's the head of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, is a very courageous, edgy thinker from Kenya. But PACTA has managed to create a network in 52 of the 54 African countries.
Wow.
That's extraordinary. And then there's Million Bile from Ethiopia, who runs the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. And again, just an extraordinary leader, an extraordinary thinker, and an integrator. And I think what all three of those have is the capacity to integrate. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Wangari Maathai, whose courage and whose understanding that trees will change politics was really significant for all of us. I mean, in fact, we're about to name our seminar room the Wangari Maathai Seminar Room.
That's fantastic. And I think her daughter would be very excited to be able to hear that as well. Maybe you should invite her to open the room as well. And as we conclude, what scares you about our world today? What excites you?
You know, what scares me is the levels of corruption and the ways in which that corruption is compromising every aspect of governance, including sciences, in the sense that privatized science labs, science for hire, are increasingly relied upon, but they're not necessarily reliable. In fact, one of the main ones has paid almost $30 million in court-levied fines in the US alone for bribery, for corruption, for misrepresentation of data. And that was in health issues and environmental issues. And I think a lot of that has to do with the financialization of everything. If that's the core problem, one of the key things is to reconnect communities with earth processes, because that's an economy on its own. And if we can connect one process here and one process here, one process there, we're not going to be able to fix all of them everywhere, because our cities have been built in the way that they have. But where we can fix the trajectory of resources, methane from a waste dump is sitting there. It can be harvested and it can become a solution for energy poverty.
Right.
And there's so many solutions like that, you know, rainwater harvesting or putting solar panels on roofs in shack settlements, which allow people to feed into the grid instead of buying up landscapes in the peri-urban areas, blowing up the hills to make them flat and creating a solar farm, right? Can we integrate? Can we democratize? So I think the key thing is financialization has brought in a brutalization of relationships. I think returning to earth processes, to tending and caring for the things that earth gives, changes our economy. And if that movement can grow, we have a chance of remediating many, many aspects of current impoverishment of households.
What excites you?
What excites me and inspires me is the team that we're working with. Our team, funded by the Science for Africa Foundation in 5 countries, is predominantly early career scholars. And the passion, the determination, the enthusiasm, the knowledge of local landscapes that they bring, it gets me out of bed in the morning.
And I think that's a good parting shot. Your last words, your call to action as we wrap up?
We need to go back to the work of Amilcar Cabral, to the work of Kwame Nkrumah, and so many of Africa's leaders that were desperately trying to create our African countries in the 1960s, in the middle of a Cold War, struggling to hold the space of a non-aligned movement, but being pulled one way or the other and then condemned. And then you saw the assassinations, the coups d'etats, one after the other. Africa's ethical leaders were taken out. Then we had a generation of militarized leaders, extremely corrupt. The Cold War ends, more or less, and the next swathe of democratization follows in Africa. But people are still sitting wondering, why is Africa so corrupt? And I think if we go back to the work of Kwame Nkrumah and Amilcar Cabral and others, you see a roadmap for ethical leadership. And the astonishing thing about Amilcar Cabral is he was a soil scientist. He was a revolutionary whose work began in soil science. There's a big fat book, it's about 750 pages, of the scientific studies that he did of soil and agronomy in Cape Verde and in Portugal, where he was studying. And on the basis of understanding soil, he came back and ended up becoming a revolutionary. And his message to Africa was, take care of your soils if you want your sovereignty. Sovereign country needs to take care of its soils. And I think if we see the devastation that's happened at the moment in Zambia, in Malawi, and so many other countries where pesticides and herbicides and patented seeds that cannot be regrown have to be bought again every year afresh, those have impoverished people and impoverished soils. We need to go back to those early ethical leaders who struggled and fought. Kwame Nkrumah's work on neocolonialism, he could have been writing that yesterday. It's so on point. It's extraordinary.
As we conclude and as we wrap up, just to say a huge thank you for your time. Listening to you, you have opened up our minds. I have to say that I am humbled by your acknowledgement about the use of, just to borrow words from your mouth, when you talked about white privilege and making sure that I use this to be able to improve the world that we live in, not just in Africa, but just worldwide. And I want to also recommend highly for people to read your book on rock, water, life, ecology and humanities for decolonizing South Africa. It's very exciting to see that you are at Anga to be able to champion the cause of a lot of the work that you do. I'm familiar with your work and the grant you recently received to be able to work across the different countries you've talked about to build early career researchers. I want to wish you well on your journey as you continue to work. We will watch this space. Lesley, thank you so much for being part of this podcast.
Thanks, lovely to chat.
Thanks for tuning in to Connecting the Dots podcast, created by me, Juliet. This episode was brought to life by Mumbua and Kevin at Silent Global in Nairobi, Kenya. If you enjoyed this episode, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it. Tag us on CTD Pod Africa on all platforms. Keep the conversation going. Let us know what you'd love to hear about. And join me on the next episode as I interview the next amazing scientist here on Connecting the Dots podcast.